When you hear Hiroshima, what comes to mind? For most, it's the iconic mushroom cloud, the Enola Gay, and the devastating end of World War II. It's a story we think we know. But what if I told you that the most visible part of this tragedy, the atomic blast itself, is only the beginning of a much deeper, darker, and more hidden story? A story of survivors shunned by their own society, of a city rebuilt on radioactive ground, and of a psychological scar that has spanned generations. This is the hidden cost of Hiroshima, a cost that was paid not just on August 6, 1945, but for decades afterward, in ways the world rarely talks about. To understand this hidden cost, we have to go back to the moments after the flash. In the surreal quiet that followed the deafening explosion, tens of thousands of survivors, dazed and horrifically injured, began to emerge from the rubble. They were known as the hibakusha, which translates to explosion-affected people. You might imagine they were met with sympathy and care. The reality was tragically different. In the immediate aftermath there was chaos. But as Japan began to rebuild, a strange and cruel social phenomenon took hold. The hibakusha were not seen as heroes or victims to be pitied. Instead, they were often viewed as contaminated, as carriers of a mysterious and frightening atomic plague. This wasn't just ignorance. It was deep-seated fear. People were terrified of the atomic disease, which we now know as radiation sickness. They worried it was contagious. As a result, many hibakusha faced profound discrimination. They struggled to find jobs because employers feared they would be chronically ill and unreliable. They were seen as a bad investment. Imagine surviving the unthinkable, only to be told you're not fit to work because of something that was done to you. The social stigma was even more pronounced when it came to marriage. Families would hire private investigators to check if a potential son-in-law or daughter-in-law was a hibakusha or came from a hibakusha family. The fear was that they would be unable to have healthy children, or that they would pass on some genetic taint. This fear created a generation of hidden hibakusha, people who concealed their past to have a chance at a normal life. They moved away, changed their names, and never spoke of what they endured. The silence became a second wound, a psychological prison built on societal prejudice. Then there was the physical cost that unfolded slowly, silently, over years and decades. While the blast killed instantly, radiation was a far more insidious killer. In the weeks, months, and years that followed, survivors began to suffer from a range of illnesses. They experienced hair loss, purple spots on their skin known as purpura, and severe fatigue. Many died from complications of acute radiation exposure, but the long-term effects were even more terrifying. Cancers, particularly leukemia and thyroid cancer, began to appear at rates far higher than in the general population. A study by the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, a joint US-Japan organization, has been tracking the health of hibakusha since 1950. Their data paints a clear, grim picture. The closer you were to the hypocenter, the higher your risk of developing cancer later in life. This wasn't just a physical battle. It was a constant state of psychological terror. Every headache, every fever, every ache and pain sparked the same terrifying question. Is this it? Is it the cancer? The hibakusha lived under a perpetual death sentence, never knowing when or if the radiation inside them would finally claim their lives. This constant anxiety, this cancer phobia, became a defining feature of the hibakusha experience. It was a form of post-traumatic stress that the world was only beginning to understand. And what about the next generation? The fear of genetic damage was one of the most powerful drivers of discrimination. For decades, there was intense worry that the children of survivors would be born with high rates of birth defects and genetic mutations. This was a heavy burden for hibakusha parents, who lived with the guilt and fear that they might have passed on a damaged legacy to their children. Fortunately, extensive, long-term studies on the children of survivors have found no statistically significant increase in birth defects or genetic diseases. While this is a huge scientific and emotional relief, it doesn't erase the decades of fear, stigma, and heartbreak these families endured. The worry itself was a form of damage, a psychological cost passed from one generation to the next. The economic cost of rebuilding Hiroshima was, of course, immense. The city was literally wiped off the map, but the rebuilding process was fraught with its own hidden challenges. How do you rebuild a city on ground that was irradiated? In the years after the war, with limited understanding of residual radiation, the rebuilding began. Debris was cleared, often by the survivors themselves, and new structures rose from the ashes. Hiroshima transformed itself into a peace city, with a hauntingly beautiful Peace Memorial Park and the Bomb Dome at its heart. But this physical rebirth masked a deeper economic struggle for the survivors. Many had lost their homes, their businesses, and their entire families. With the added burden of discrimination and chronic health problems, climbing out of poverty was a monumental task. The Japanese government was slow to act. It wasn't until 1957, 12 years after the bombing, that the bomb victims' medical care law was passed, providing health checkups and medical care for recognized hibakusha. But this aid was often bureaucratic and difficult to access. Many survivors felt abandoned by their own government, left to navigate a complex and often unsympathetic system on their own. The economic recovery of the city as a whole did not always translate to the economic recovery of its most traumatized citizens. So, when we look at the legacy of Hiroshima, it's crucial to look beyond the black and white photos of destruction. The true cost wasn't just paid in a single, blinding flash. It was paid in the quiet suffering of the hibakusha, in the jobs they were denied, the marriages they couldn't have, and the secrets they were forced to keep. It was paid in the waiting rooms of hospitals decades later, as they confronted the long shadow of radiation. It was paid in the tears of parents who feared for their children's future. The story of the hibakusha is a powerful testament to human resilience, but it's also a stark warning. It teaches us that the consequences of war, especially nuclear war, don't end when the fighting stops. They ripple outward, across generations, creating invisible wounds that are often deeper and more painful than the visible ones. By understanding the hidden costs of Hiroshima, we gain a more complete and a more human understanding of why such a weapon must never be used again.